How can there be a God with so much evil and suffering in the world? Let's think about it for a moment. We don't have to think that hard, to tell you the truth. Babies die. Children are abused. School kids get shot and killed. Women get raped, and wars get fought. And that's just really, we're just scratching the surface. I looked up before our show here today how many diseases can afflict the human body. And, is one of those things where I couldn't get an accurate count, that there's so many different things that can afflict our bodies. And so why doesn't God step in and do something about this? Why doesn't he step in and minimize this evil that we experience here in life? And so maybe the issue is that we need to think a little bit more deeply about how we can frame this issue with respect to the existence of God. And that's going to be our focus here on this particular episode of 5 Good Reasons Why God Exists. I'm Kerry Decker, your host. We'll be right back. My guest with me today is Dr. Kirk McGregor, and he is the chair of the philosophy department at McPherson College. And right before we came on air, he told me to make sure you say McPherson and not McPherson, because there is no fear in McPherson. So,
that's absolutely right.
So tell me, Kirk, a little bit about your interests. I know that you've written a number of books. Share with me about some of those books that you've written.
Well, most recently this year, I wrote Contemporary Theology and Introduction, published by Zondervan. Then in 2015, I wrote Luis de Molina, The Life and Theology of the Founder of Middle Knowledge, also published by Zondervan. Then in 2011, I wrote a book on parallels between Japanese Buddhism and European Christianity, and that was published by Mellon Press. In 2007, I published a book called A Molinist Anabaptist Systematic Theology, published by University Press of America. And then in 2006, I wrote A Central European Synthesis of Radical and Magisterial Reform, which is a book on the Anabaptist theologian Balthasar Hubmaier, also published with University Press of America.
It sounds to me like a lot of these books are kind of more of the academic nature than they are the popular nature.
Oh, none of my books are on the popular nature.
Yeah, okay.
I sometimes wonder if I'm capable of writing a popular level.
Yeah. Well, you're kind of like the go-to guy when it comes to this whole topic of Molinism, and I know that may be a theological topic that we could save for another day. But when I look it up on YouTube and I start looking at shows, is that Kirk McGregor's name comes up a lot on these discussions. And but we're not here necessarily to talk about Molinism. There is, I guess, a nexus or some sort of connection between Molinism and the problem of evil, and I'm sure we'll touch a little bit on that today. But let me just ask you straight out, is that because, first of all, evil and suffering is an incorrigible reality of the human experience. And so isn't that evidence enough that God does not exist?
No, it actually fails to provide any evidence against God's existence.
Okay, you're going to have to explain that.
Yeah, think about the two statements. One, God exists, and two, pointless evil and suffering exist.
Yeah.
Notice that these two statements are not contradictory to each other.
Yeah.
That is to say, one is not the negation of two, and two is not the negation of one. The negation of one, God exists, is 1 star, God does not exist.
Yeah.
Not two, pointless evil and suffering exist. And the negation of two is 2 star, pointless evil and suffering do not exist. Not one, God exists.
Okay.
The only way someone can try to make 1 and 2 contradictory is to add 2 hidden premises. And those hidden premises most people just take for granted.
Yeah.
Let's call them 3 and 4. So 3 would be, if God is omnipotent, then God can create a world without pointless evil and suffering.
Okay.
And 4, if God is all-loving, then God prefers a world without pointless evil and suffering.
Yeah.
Now, it's important to note that by world, I mean the entire history of the world, past, present, and future. Mm-hmm. So, for example, someone might say, well, what about heaven, for example?
Yeah.
Isn't heaven a world in and of itself? And the answer is no. Heaven is not a world in and of itself. It is part of this reality. So we'll get to that in more detail later.
Yeah, you're going to have to explain that one to me.
Yeah.
But you said you'll get to it in a bit. You know?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think the problem is that both of those hidden assumptions, 3 and 4, are false. Here's why. Concerning 3, omnipotence means the ability to do anything logically possible.
Gotcha.
Not anything, period. So God can't make 2 + 2 = 8.
Yeah.
But one could argue, and again, I hope to get into further depth later, intrinsic perfection is an incommunicable attribute of God. It's an attribute like omnipotence or omniscience that God can't transfer over to another being. And if that's true, it's logically impossible for God to create anything with intrinsic perfection. So if that line of reasoning works, it would eliminate the problem of natural pointless evil and suffering.
Okay.
Now,
all right, connect the dots for me on that, because I'm not seeing how that does that. You're saying because he can't create a world that is intrinsically perfect. Is that right? Because it's not a communicable property of God.
Correct.
And so the world has the potential for going off the rails. Am I understanding that correctly?
You're understanding that correctly. Yeah. And I think that when we talk about natural evil, I'll get back to that point of why I think it's true that it's logically impossible for God to create anything with intrinsic perfection.
Yeah.
Now, concerning moral evil, it seems that we have what philosophers call libertarian freedom.
Okay.
And the logical structure of libertarian freedom entails that people who hold it possess both the unconstrained ability to choose anything on the moral spectrum, from the greatest goods to the worst evils, and the unimpeded power to actualize their choices.
Okay, so they can do whatever they want, essentially, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so if God has chosen to create libertarian free creatures capable of having a personal love relationship with God, because love is a free choice, that God cannot prevent those creatures from choosing and actualizing anything on the moral spectrum. So if that line of argument works, then 3, if God is omnipotent, then God can create a world without pointless evil and suffering, is false. For, on my estimation, creating a world without pointless evil and suffering is logically impossible.
Okay.
And I'll go into why I think that way later on.
Yeah.
Concerning 4, if God is all-loving, then God prefers a world without pointless evil and suffering. I don't even think that's true.
Okay,
so
all right.
Imagine,
again, you're going to have to explain that one to me.
Imagine that everything that I just said is false, that it is possible for God to create a world without pointless evil and suffering. Well, then, let's imagine 2 worlds. In one world, there is no pointless evil and suffering, but there are only 2 people in that world. If God were to add any more persons, then at least one of them would commit pointless evil. In another world, there are billions of people who freely receive God's salvation, but there is a tremendous amount of pointless evil and suffering.
Yeah.
Which world would an all-loving God choose?
Yeah.
Well, if God is all-loving, that would mean that God's greatest or overriding desire is for as many persons as possible to freely come into a saving love relationship with him. Mm-hmm. His greatest or overriding desire is not evil prevention. So an all-loving God would not prefer the world with less evil because it has the overriding deficiency of less salvation.
Okay.
So it seems that if God is all-loving, then God prefers a world without pointless evil and suffering is false. Mm-hmm. That's why I think even adding the hidden assumptions 3 and 4, it remains the case that pointless evil and suffering logically do absolutely nothing to refute God's existence or even to call it into question.
Yeah, okay. And I hear you talking, and I would agree that logically that works, okay? You've convinced me this thus far,
Yeah.
But there's something kind of like deep within my being that protests evil and suffering.
Right.
And talk a little bit about that.
Well, I would say there's something deep within the being of God that protests evil and suffering.
Yeah.
And if what I've said is correct, then God is far more sad, far more devastated, far more horrified with evil and suffering in the world than we are, or even could be.
Or you could even take it personally. You say, God is much more offended by evil than you, Carrie.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I heard a guy once say this, and tell me if this is correct. He said that even if we don't have a good understanding why evil and suffering exist, that doesn't mean God doesn't have his reasons.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And it also doesn't mean, if you follow my train of argument, that there might not be logical reasons which would constrain God from doing anything about it.
Yeah, okay. So he may be kind of like looking at this from a perspective that we don't understand.
Right.
And have his good reasons, and at the same time not giving us a good explanation.
Yeah. I think what you're pointing out is that there are multiple possible answers to the problem of evil.
Yeah.
The one that I provide, and I'm kind of known for in the literature, is answering the problem on this logical level.
Okay.
Trying to say there are logical constraints which prohibit God from preventing pointless suffering and evil. But there is a different line of answer, which also could be true.
Okay.
And this might be that God has God's own reasons. God has God's own hidden purposes. That maybe God permits evil to bring about greater goods or something like that. And so it's important to see that my solution to the problem of evil is not the only one out there. And I think that these solutions complement each other very nicely.
Okay, yeah. So how might real and objective evil actually count for God's existence?
To say that evil is real and objective means that some things are truly evil, independently of human belief, opinion, evolutionary conditioning, etc., just as 2 + 2 = 4 is mathematically true, independently of human belief, opinion, evolutionary conditioning, etc.
Yeah.
So, to give an example, maintaining that the Holocaust was objectively evil means that it was evil, even though the Nazis who carried it out thought it was good.
Yeah.
And would still be evil even if the Nazis had won World War II and succeeded in exterminating or brainwashing everyone who disagreed with them.
Yeah.
Even if everyone on Earth agreed that the Holocaust was good, it would still be evil, and everyone would simply be mistaken.
Yeah.
Just as everyone would simply be mistaken if they all believed 2 + 2 = 8.
Yeah, yeah.
Now,
So even if we lived in a world, some sort of demonic world, where everybody agreed that exterminating Jews was a good thing to do, it would
right,
still be objectively wrong, correct?
correct.
All right. So connect the dots now. How does
Right.
that point to God?
So, given that evil is real and objective, let's call that premise 1, it logically follows that premise 2, objective moral values exist.
Okay.
Namely, that some things are objectively evil rather than merely seeming evil to us. Now let's add the crucial third premise, namely 3. If God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I get it.
Now, to see the truth of 3, let's imagine 2 reels of human history. Reel A is evolution with the existence of God, and reel B is evolution without the existence of God.
Yeah.
On reel A, objective moral values are grounded in the nature of God, which is the objective standard or yardstick of goodness. So things like love, faithfulness, generosity, and altruism are good because they measure up, so to speak, to God's nature. And things like hatred, abuse, discrimination, and oppression are evil because they in no way measure up to God's nature. The human cognitive faculties are human abilities to apprehend objective moral values, then gradually evolve over time, becoming more and more accurate as sociobiological evolution progresses.
Yeah.
So our cognitive faculties fallibly and gradually apprehend or discover the moral values that are already there in the nature of God. Just as our cognitive faculties fallibly and gradually apprehend or discover the physical world that is already there scientifically.
Yeah.
So that's reel A. But on reel B, there is no God, and evolution becomes the means not by which we apprehend or discover pre-existing moral values, but the means by which we generate or invent moral values. What happened in Nazi Germany is simply the product of the moral values generated by sociobiological evolution in that time and place.
Yeah.
And our moral values are equally the product of sociobiological evolution in our time and place.
And nobody actually has the best moral values. Yeah.
Right. Neither is objectively right and neither is objectively wrong.
Yeah.
Even worse, if we were to go back in time on reel B and run the film of reel B again, human evolution would have taken a different course and generated a completely different set of moral values than those we know.
Yeah.
So it seems fairly obvious that premise 3, if God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist, is true.
Yeah.
Now here's where we can draw together the threads. Put the 3 premises together.
Okay.
Premise 1, evil is real and objective. Premise 2, objective moral values exist because some things are objectively evil.
Yeah.
3, if God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. From these premises, it follows logically and inescapably that 4, God exists. So real and objective evil actually proves God's existence, since without God, nothing could be really or objectively evil.
Yeah, yeah. You know, I tried to make that point once in a philosophy class in a secular college, and people just looked at me like a deer in the headlights. You know,
Yes.
They just didn't get it. You know.
Yes.
But what if I'm hearing what you're saying correct is that there is no caveman back in the day who conked his fellow caveman over the head with a club and said, "Ha ha! I just invented murder." You know, moral rights and duties are not something that we invent. They're something that we discover.
Correct. Correct.
And they're an aspect of reality that transcends the physical reality, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So we discover moral facts in the same way that we discover mathematical facts,
Yeah.
which are similarly not part of physical reality. So the reality of the number 2 is not a physical fact. If it is, I'd like for you to point to me to the number 2 existing somewhere.
Where it exists. Yeah.
Or the way we come to know the laws of logic. The laws of logic are certainly real, but show me the physical existence of the laws of logic. Again, you can't do it.
Yeah, I remember once in a class that and we were talking about some mathematics luminary from the past, and they said that, well, he invented differential calculus. I can't remember if it was Newton or whoever.
Right.
And I'm thinking to myself, is that he didn't invent it.
Right.
It was there before his head existed.
Yes, exactly.
He discovered it.
Right.
You know? And it seems that the same is true with these moral truths.
Correct.
We don't invent that racism is wrong.
Right.
Or slavery that is wrong. We discover that.
Yes.
You know? Yeah. So let's kind of shift gears for a moment and ask this question, that if God is good and loving, then why doesn't he prevent egregious evildoers from doing evil? Why doesn't he stop Adolf Hitler? Why doesn't he stop Joseph Stalin? Why doesn't he stop the school shooter? Why doesn't God jump in and do something about this evil if he's all good and loving? If you want to hear Dr. McGregor's answer to this question of why God doesn't intervene to stop evildoers from doing egregious evil, then make sure to tune in for his next installment here on 5 good reasons why God exists. We'll see you in part 2.